The alarm didn't go off. It never did. The grand chamber of the Galactic Assembly was a place of perfect order, where every protocol was followed with the surgical precision of civilizations that measured their history in hundreds of thousands of years. That was exactly why Ambassador Sophia Reyes knew, the moment she stepped across the threshold, that she was about to be humiliated. The chamber was colossal, not just because of its size, though it effortlessly held delegations from 47 species. It was colossal by design. Every architectural detail was calculated to make a visitor feel small. The crystal columns of Veth Anor rose 600 feet to a translucent dome where the light of 3 distinct suns filtered through in simultaneous spectrums. The seats of the higher races, the so-called sovereigns, were elevated in concentric arcs that forced any representative from the lower tier to crane their neck just to look at their judges. Sophia didn't crane her neck. She walked to the center of the petitioner's platform with her shoulders level, her data case pressed against her left side, and her eyes fixed on Primarch Vel-Katan, leader of the Sovereign Consortium. He was a Velhari, 11 feet tall, with skin that absorbed light like polished obsidian and composite eyes that captured frequencies far beyond the human visible spectrum. By his species standards, he was being deliberately condescending by not deigning to use his vocal amplifier. His voice reached Sophia anyway, resonating like thunder inside granite. "The petitioner from Earth has 90 seconds of protocol," he said. "I suggest you use them wisely." Sophia opened the case. She projected the data onto the chamber's central hologram. Numbers, coordinates, logs of unanswered distress signals. 117 human colonies in the galactic outer rim. 62 pirate fleet attacks in the last 6 standard years. 43 colonies responding with absolute silence after the raids. Silence wasn't a euphemism. It was the technical term the Assembly used for presumably destroyed. "Petitioners of the Sovereign Consortium," Sophia said, her voice activating the universal translator on the public frequency so all 47 delegations could hear, each in their preferred tongue. "Humanity is not here to ask for favors. We are here to exercise a right that was denied to us 230 standard years ago when we signed the Keth Vora Treaty. The right to protect our own people." She paused, not for dramatic effect, but because she needed to be sure the chamber had processed the numbers she had projected. 43 colonies, she repeated. Approximately 800,000 people. Missing. And every request for intervention sent to this assembly has been cataloged, filed, and answered with the same boilerplate statement. Outer Rim security is under protocol review. Vel-Katan raised one of his 4 upper limbs, a gesture the chamber recognized as a signal for an immediate rebuttal. "The ambassador of Earth confuses a matter of galactic security with a domestic issue," he said. "The sovereign fleets patrol millions of light years of space. We prioritize threats based on scale. Losses in the Outer Rim are regrettable, yet statistically irrelevant." 800,000 people are statistically irrelevant, Sophia repeated slowly, as if confirming she had heard him correctly. "For a species with a population of 12 billion? Vel-Katan tilted his head slightly. "Yes." The murmur that rippled through the chamber wasn't one of indignation. It was casual agreement. Sophia recorded that. She tucked it away in a place inside her where things that need to be remembered are stored without consuming emotional energy. "Then Earth's formal petition," she said, "is as follows. We request authorization to build and operate a limited defense fleet. 20 interceptor-class ships, armed only with shield systems and low-power disruption cannons, exclusively for patrolling the human outer rim. No offensive capability projected beyond our colonial zone." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. After that, the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Assembly heard something its designers had never anticipated: laughter. It wasn't the laughter of one species. It was the laughter of 17 species simultaneously, each expressing the emotion through the physical register of their biology. The Kethrai swayed their laminar bodies in waves. The Soru emitted pulses of bioluminescence that their neighbors recognized as mirth. The Velhari, more restrained by culture, simply allowed their vocal amplifiers to emit the equivalent of a disdainful snort. Vel-Katan waited for decorum to be partially restored before continuing. Earth, he said, is a species cataloged as Tau class, technologically dependent, structurally unstable, with a documented history of internal conflict spanning your entire recorded history. The last time this assembly authorized weapons for a Tau-class species, the result was the Vithara Purge. 208 civilizations eradicated in 80 standard years. With all due respect, Sophia said, humans have not eradicated other civilizations. We have internal conflicts, yes, but there is not a single historical record of a human war of aggression against an extraterrestrial species. Because you haven't had the opportunity, Vel-Katan replied with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a child. That is not a compliment, Ambassador. It is a fact of containment. Sophia closed her case. She retracted the hologram. So the Assembly's official answer is no. The official answer, Vel-Katan said, now with the bureaucratic coldness that was his natural voice, is that Earth's request is in violation of Article 17 of the Keth-Vora Treaty, which prohibits the development of offensive military technologies by Tau-class species without sovereign oversight. Furthermore, the consortium informs you that Earth's mineral extraction tribute will see a 12% increase starting next cycle as compensation for the administrative resources spent on this petition. Sophia stared at Vel-Katan for a moment. Then she nodded. Understood, she said. I am certain this assembly will record this session accurately in its archives. As it does all sessions, Vel-Katan confirmed, already turning to other matters. Sophia walked back toward the exit without rushing. No delegation called out to her. No representative expressed solidarity. The only being that crossed her path was a Kethrai janitor sweeping the hallway with a molecular cleaning device, who stepped aside so she could pass with an automatic deference that had nothing to do with respect. The moment the chamber doors closed behind her, Sophia Reyes took a deep breath. Then she opened an encrypted channel on the subcutaneous communication chip in her left wrist. The transmission was encoded in a protocol the Assembly didn't recognize as communication technology. To sovereign scanners, it was just the thermal noise of a biological organism. Was 10 years of preparation enough? She whispered. The answer came with a 3-second delay, compensating for the signal distance. 8 years were enough, said the voice on the other side. A voice most people in the Assembly had never heard, belonging to a man most galactic records didn't even know existed. But 10 years is a comfortable margin. You did what needed to be done, Sophia. I made them laugh. Exactly, said Dr. Marcus Webb. And now they won't be looking where we need them not to look. Sophia walked down the Assembly's exit corridor while calculating how long it would take to reach the transition station. She didn't look back. There was nothing in that chamber she ever needed to see again. What she needed to see was 42 light-years away, silently orbiting in the rings of a blue gas giant that most galactic cartographers had dismissed as irrelevant 2 centuries ago. The galaxy had just rejected humanity. Humanity had been waiting for exactly that. The official name of the facility was Mineral Extraction Outpost Kappa 7, registered in the Galactic Assembly archives as a low-efficiency helium-3 mining operation run by 418 human colonists in the outer rings of Lupus Gamma 4, a turquoise gas giant 42 light-years from Earth. The production records were meticulously mediocre. Never bad enough to trigger audits, never good enough to spark greed. It was, from the perspective of any sovereign inspector who had bothered to look, exactly what it appeared to be. Chief Engineer Rajan Mehta had spent the last 6 years of his life ensuring it stayed that way. Rajan was a man who had been described by different people throughout his career as brilliant, obsessive, unpredictable, and the greatest living expert in quantum state physics applied to propulsion systems. That last description was the only one he considered relevant. The other three were just natural consequences of spending more hours inside a lab than out of it. At that moment, he was inside the main containment chamber of Kappa 7, wearing photon radiation goggles and holding a cup of coffee he had forgotten was in his hand. "Marcus," he said without looking at the scientist who had just entered through the pressurized hatch behind him. The superposition field collapsed again. "I know," said Dr. Marcus Webb, crossing the chamber with the haste of someone who had run half the length of the main corridor. "I saw the sensors. But it collapsed differently this time." Rajan spun toward him. "Differently how?" "Differently as in controlled." The two men looked at each other for a moment. Then, simultaneously, they turned to the chamber's central holographic display. What was projected there was technically impossible. Not impossible in the popular sense of the term, the sense where people say something is impossible when they mean it's hard. Impossible in the mathematical sense. The equation describing the current state of the quantum containment matrix violated 4 separate principles of physics that had been considered axiomatic by every civilization in the galactic assembly for at least 50,000 standard years. The ship existed in 2 states simultaneously. Not metaphorically, not as a subatomic scale quantum fluctuation that collapses as soon as it's observed. The ship, all 7.5 miles of it, was physically present in 2 positions in space at the same time, with both positions being equally real, equally solid, and equally measurable. "The field didn't collapse," Rajan said slowly, processing what he saw. "The field bifurcated. And then it stabilized," Marcus confirmed, "for 11 seconds, the longest we've managed so far." 11 seconds, Rajan repeated. He took a sip of his coffee. He grimaced because the coffee had been cold for at least 2 hours. He took another sip anyway. "What changed?" Marcus opened a secondary data panel. "Captain Voss was on board during the test." Rajan blinked. "She was sleeping in the observation quarters. She didn't even know we were running a test." "Exactly," Marcus said. "She wasn't trying to observe the ship's state. She was asleep, likely dreaming, with her mind in a state of diffuse coherence, not deliberate collapse. And the field responded to her presence in a way it never responded to any of us when we were actively monitoring it." Rajan set the cup down on the nearest workbench. It was the first time in months he had consciously let go of his coffee. "You're saying the ship responds better when it's not being observed with intent?" "I'm saying the ship responds to the specific type of observation that is biologically unique to humans," Marcus said. "Consciousness in a flow state, not focus, not directed attention. The mental state that exists between intention and instinct, which humans developed over millennia of decision-making under chaotic conditions." Rajan remained silent for a considerable time. Outside, through the 10-foot-thick walls of composite steel and pressure fields, the rings of Lupus Gamma 4 spun in patterns most humans had never seen and likely never would. "When is Sophia's transmission window?" he finally asked. 4 hours, Marcus said. She left the assembly. The petition was denied, as we expected. Good. Good. Anything else would have complicated the timeline. Rajan turned back to the workbench and picked up his coffee again. 4 hours is enough time for me to reformulate the field parameters. If what you're saying about Captain Voss is right, he didn't finish the sentence because the security chamber alarm cut him off. It wasn't an emergency alarm. It was the alarm Rajan had personally installed, calibrated for a single purpose: to detect a human origin distress signal on the colony communication band, the kind of signal the Assembly had authorized colonists to use specifically to contact sovereign security in case of an attack. The signal that over the last 6 years had been sent 43 times and ignored 43 times. Marcus went to the comms panel. His expression, which had been one of scientific excitement 3 seconds ago, shifted. "It's the Delta 9 mining colony," he said. "Orion 4 sector. Rajan knew Delta 9. Every engineer in the Outer Rim knew Delta 9. It was 18 families operating a silicate extraction platform in a binary system. Good workers. People who had built their own school out of ship scrap because the assembly had denied their request for educational supplies. "Are they under attack?" he asked. "Worse," Marcus said. "The signal is from a sovereign fleet. Execution code." Rajan went still. An execution code meant the assembly had determined the colony had committed some violation of the treaty. In the bureaucratic language of the sovereigns, an execution was the forced removal of an illegal facility, followed by the neutralization of any resistance. In human language, it meant something else entirely. "Why?" Rajan asked, though part of him already knew. Marcus expanded the communication signal. In the text transmission, there was an inspection report. 2 months earlier, a pirate fleet from the Keshvar cartel had attacked Delta 9. The colonists, with no protection available, had built 2 rudimentary ion cannons from mining components, just enough to drive the pirate ships away. No one had been killed. The colony had survived. And then they had reported the incident to the sovereign authorities, honestly, because they were people who believed in following the rules. The assembly had classified the improvised cannons as unauthorized development of offensive technology in violation of Article 17. The execution code had been issued 3 days later. "How long until the fleet arrives?" Rajan asked. "The signal was sent 4 hours ago. Trajectory data indicates the fleet has already arrived." The chamber fell into absolute silence, except for the constant hum of the quantum field generators that had been built 8 years ago by people who knew they would one day need to be used. Rajan Mehta looked at the ship. All 7.5 miles of it, invisible in the radiation haze of Lupus Gamma 4's rings, existing in a state between the possible and the impossible. "Marcus," he said, "wake up Captain Voss." "Rajan, the ship isn't ready. We need more tests. The field parameters are still unstable." "I know. If she tries to navigate in superposition without a full stabilization protocol, there could be a field collapse that—" "I know." Rajan cut his colleague off, not with anger, but with the calm of someone who had reached the edge of a decision. "Wake Elena up and prepare a full report of what we know about how she interacts with the field." He paused. "And Marcus, bring more coffee. Mine went cold." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then, without saying another word, he went to wake the captain. Coffee, Rajan knew, was one of the most curious substances humans had developed throughout their history. Moderately toxic to at least 12 assembly species. Completely harmless to humans who had integrated it so deeply into their culture that routine consumption in crisis situations had become a sort of ritual for mental clarity. He had once heard a Velhari xenobiologist describe human caffeine dependence as a curious biological vulnerability. Rajan had smiled at the time. He hadn't corrected the xenobiologist. There were things about humans the assembly didn't understand. And as long as they didn't understand, they would keep underestimating. That was, and had always been, their greatest advantage. Elena Voss had woken up with the awareness that something was wrong before she understood what it was. It wasn't a sound. Kappa 7's soundproofing systems were perfect. She had overseen their installation herself. It wasn't light. The observation quarters had a total blackout during the rest cycle. It was something she couldn't name, the feeling of a space that had shifted in pressure while she slept, as if the air around her had expanded slightly, or as if the room had suddenly become larger in ways that weren't measurable with a ruler. She was awake with her eyes open before Marcus had crossed half the distance to her bunk. "What's the problem?" she asked. Marcus stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared a careful introduction and just realized it was unnecessary. "Delta 9, he said. "And the ship." Elena sat up. She ran her hands through her short hair. 42 years old, a force field scar on her left forearm from the Proxima 7 incident 12 years prior, eyes a brown so dark they looked black in low light. She had been tapped for command of the Last Hope, for a combination of reasons Rajan had documented in 47 pages of psychological analysis, and Marcus had summarized in one line, "She thinks on her feet." In 18 years of service in the Outer Rim Patrol Forces, Elena had developed something her instructors called diffuse tactical awareness, the ability to hold multiple scenarios in parallel without collapsing any of them into premature certainty. It was a mental state most people developed partially. Some specialized operatives developed it to a higher degree, and Elena Voss had developed it to a level her psych evaluators described as clinically remarkable, yet within parameters of healthy functionality, which was the polite way of saying she thought in a way most people couldn't follow. Rajan had told her 2 years ago when he recruited her for the project, "The ship isn't a vehicle you pilot, it's a state you inhabit." Elena had replied, "Explain," and he had explained, for 5 hours, at the end of which Elena had asked 3 questions. Rajan had answered the first 2 and remained silent at the third, which was, "So the problem isn't learning to control the field, it's learning to stop trying to control it?" Rajan had said, "Yes, exactly that, and I don't know if that's something that can be taught." Elena had said, "Fine, I'll figure it out." 2 years of training, 2 years of immersion sessions in the ship's control core, where she learned not to do what all her pilot instincts told her to do, which was to focus, analyze, decide. She learned instead to exist in a state of panoramic attention that was simultaneously hyper-aware and completely non-directive. It was like learning to see with peripheral vision without moving your eyes to the center, except the field of vision was 3-dimensional, quantum, and involved the perception of probability states that classical physics classified as mutually exclusive. She hadn't succeeded in the first week, or the first month. She had succeeded for the first time in the 13th month, during a late-night calibration session, when she was so exhausted she had simply stopped trying and allowed her consciousness to drift. The superposition field had activated in 3 seconds. Since then, she had learned to recreate that state on demand, something that was technically impossible to teach and that she had discovered empirically was possible to learn. Now, standing in the access corridor of the containment chamber, listening to Rajan explain what had happened at Delta 9, Elena Voss processed the information the only way she knew how, without reaching a conclusion before having all the data. "How many ships in the execution fleet?" she asked. "The distress signal included basic telemetry," Marcus said. 18 ships, heavy cruiser class. Armament? Long-range plasma cannons. Torvath full field shields. Sovereign standard." Elena nodded. "And our weapons systems are still in test protocol. 2 functional bow-photon coherent emitters, and the disruption field system Rajan installed on the upper hull." "Right," Rajan said. "Elena, I want to be explicit about the margins of error. The superposition field protocol has a 32% failure rate over the last 100 tests. In a real combat environment, with the stress of decision-making." "The failure rate drops," Elena interrupted. Rajan looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because the tests that failed were the ones where I was trying to do it right," she said. "The ones that worked were the ones where I was just trying to do something." Rajan was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "There's one more thing," Marcus said. His expression had shifted to what Elena recognized as the face he made when he was about to say something he knew she wouldn't want to hear. "Delta 9 is 19 hours away at standard warp drive." "Not in superposition," Elena said. In superposition, displacement is instantaneous, yes, but only if you can keep the field stable long enough to complete the jump. We've never done a superposition jump in a real environment. Only in simulation, and only with the ship stationary. Then it'll be the first time. Elena, Marcus said, if the field collapses during the jump, the ship will materialize in a state of incomplete superposition. We have no data on what that means for the ship's physical structure or the crew on board. Elena looked at the two men. Then she looked through the observation window at the ship, which existed there in the space of Lupus Gamma 4's rings, like a promise that had taken 8 years to build. How many people are on Delta 9? She asked. 18 families, Marcus said. Estimated 120 people, including children. Elena turned toward the access hatch. I need 8 minutes for the control chamber entry protocol. Start the pre-activation sequence for the emitters. Elena, Rajan said. She was already moving, but she stopped. The ship has never been tested in combat. We don't know what it's truly capable of. Elena looked at him over her shoulder. There was something in her eyes that Rajan would later describe to Marcus as certainty without arrogance, a state he rarely encountered in people, and which was, coincidentally, the mental state most suited for operating a system that relied on consciousness in flow. That's why I'm going to find out while I'm doing it, she said, and she stepped into the control chamber. The control chamber of the Last Hope wasn't what most people imagined when they thought of a 7-mile-long ship's cockpit. There were no conventional control panels, no buttons, levers, or joysticks. There was a chair in the center of a 6-foot-diameter sphere lined with a material Rajan called neuro-quantum interface polymer, and Elena called the stuff that feels like gel but isn't. When she sat in the chair and closed her eyes, the polymer recorded the neural activity patterns of her consciousness and translated them into field parameters. It wasn't a digital interface. There was no signal latency. It was more like breathing, except what she breathed was probabilistic geometry. Elena sat down. She closed her eyes. She didn't think about Delta 9. She didn't think about the 18 families. She didn't think about the 32% failure rate. She thought about the feeling of the space around the ship, the gravitational texture of the gas rings, the silent weight of stars at distances her mind didn't measure in miles, but in possibilities. The superposition field activated in 2 seconds. A new record. Outside, in the corridors of Kappa 7, Rajan Mehta looked at the sensors, then at Marcus, then back at the sensors. She's moving the ship, he said. Where to? Marcus asked, though he knew the answer. Rajan looked at the coordinates for the Orion 4 sector. To where she needs to be, he said. And then, because he was a scientist, and because the situation demanded some kind of emotional response proportional to the magnitude of what was happening, Rajan Mehta picked up his cup of cold coffee and took a long sip. Admiral Ozar Velset had commanded sovereign fleets for 83 standard years, which, in a Velhari's life cycle, corresponded roughly to the midpoint of a seasoned officer's career. He had suppressed rebellions from 4 different species, patrolled the Keth Ravar Nebula during the piracy surge of the previous century, and had been responsible for the intervention at Proxima 7 that the Assembly still called a pacification operation and the rest of the galaxy called other things. Ozar was not a cruel man in the sense the word implies for emotionally volatile species. He was simply efficient. The difference between cruelty and efficiency, in his view, was entirely a matter of subjective perspective, and subjective perspectives were, by definition, irrelevant to military strategy. The execution of the Delta 9 colony had lasted 42 minutes. Ozar had recorded the time in the mission log, with the precision regulation required, noting that the human colonists had attempted to operate 2 home-built ion cannons, which had been neutralized in 18 seconds by his fleet's standard shields before they could cause any measurable damage. The colonists had evacuated to the underground structure before the final phase of the operation. Ozar had recorded that too, in the collateral damage minimization column. not out of sentimentality, but because sovereign regulation preferred relocated populations over eradicated ones when the situation allowed for the distinction. The fleet had received new orders the moment the operation concluded. Proceed to the human solar system, coordinates of the third planet, where an occupation garrison would be established as the official response to the denied petition in the Assembly. It was a preemptive measure. Humanity had dared to make a formal request for weaponry, and even though the request had been denied, the history of Tau-class species suggested that denied requests often resulted in unauthorized attempts. Better to establish a presence before that became necessary. The fleet of 300 ships had dropped out of warp approximately 7 billion miles from Earth, near the system's 8th planet. A blue giant the humans called Neptune. PULSAR had chosen the exit point deliberately, far enough to give human sensors time to register the fleet before any confrontation, close enough to demonstrate that distance was no protection. He had expected panic transmissions, perhaps desperate attempts at diplomatic contact. What he hadn't expected was silence. "Admiral," said the sensor officer, "there is a reading anomaly in the warp exit region." "Define it," PULSAR said. "Sensors are registering an extremely large mass signature, but there is nothing visible. No light emission, no conventional propulsion signature. Gravitational interference from Neptune's rings? Verified. The anomaly does not match any natural body cataloged in this system." PULSAR stood up from his command chair. In 83 years of service, he had learned to distinguish between the kind of anomaly that was a technical glitch and the kind that was something else. "Force field scan on the anomaly region," he ordered. "Admiral, if there were something there, scan it." The sensor officer obeyed. For 7 seconds, the fleet's field scanning system pointed at the seemingly empty space near Neptune's rings and sent out energy pulses that should, in theory, return with precise data on any material object in the region. The pulses didn't return. They weren't absorbed. They weren't reflected. They simply didn't return, as if they had scattered over an area so large the receiver couldn't reconstruct a coherent pattern. "Admiral," the sensor officer said, with a quality in his voice PULSAR immediately identified as the sound individuals make when they are about to say something they'd rather not have to say. "The anomaly is moving." Elena Voss wasn't thinking about 300 ships. She was thinking about the space between the ships. It was an important distinction. A conventional pilot would look at a fleet of 300 units and process them as 300 obstacles, 300 targets, 300 variables. The diffuse tactical awareness Elena had developed over 18 months of training and 2 years of operating the Last Hope processed the pattern in a fundamentally different way. She saw the gaps, the intervals between the ships, the probability geometries that existed in the formation's openings, and in a state of quantum superposition, the gaps were where a ship could exist and not exist simultaneously. "Rajan," she said, through the ship's internal communication system installed to connect the control chamber with engineering and the operations center, where Rajan, Marcus, and the other 42 crew members of the Last Hope followed the data in real time. "What's the field stability?" 91%, Rajan said. "Best number we've ever recorded. What are you doing differently?" "Nothing," Elena said. "That's the point." What she had discovered over 2 years of operating the system was that the ship responded to the quality of attention, not the quantity. A fleet of 300 sovereign ships was objectively a threat, but a threat wasn't something that changed physics. It was something that changed the operator's biochemistry, and when the operator's biochemistry changed, the superposition field became unstable. The trick, which wasn't exactly a trick, was to treat 300 warships exactly the same way she would treat the gas rings of Lupus Gamma 4, as geometry, as a pattern, as habitable space. The Last Hope materialized in the center of the sovereign formation. For the crews of the sovereign ships, Detection sensors registered a 7.5-mile mass signature instantly appearing in the middle of their fleet, less than 1,000 feet from Admiral Ozar's flagship. Then, before any weapons system could calibrate, the signature vanished. It reappeared 2,000 miles away. Then it vanished again. The disruption field operated from a geometry that classical physics classified as impossible. The photon-coherent emitters fired from positions that didn't correspond to the ship's physical location at the moment of firing, because the ship existed in multiple positions simultaneously, and the shots could originate from any of them. For sovereign shield systems, which were calculated to intercept projectiles and energy coming from physically possible directions, it was the equivalent of trying to protect against something attacking from an angle that didn't exist. 34 ships lost their shield fields in the first 90 seconds, incapacitated by the disruption of their power systems without catastrophic structural damage. The crews survived. The ships drifted. Ozar Velset had seen many things in 83 years of service. He had commanded battles against superior forces. He had made tactical decisions under pressure that sovereign strategy manuals described as no-win situations. What was happening now wasn't in any manual. "What is she?" he said, more to himself than to his staff. "Admiral, we cannot determine the ship's composition. Scans return contradictory data. She appears to be in multiple points simultaneously. Fire on her. We are trying. Targeting systems cannot establish a fixed point of origin to calibrate." Ozar stood in the center of his bridge, watching the tactical displays show, over the next 17 minutes, the systematic and methodical collapse of his fleet. There was no panic in the process, no cruelty. It was more like watching someone disassemble a complicated mechanism with surgical patience, removing piece by piece without damaging the whole. Not a single ship was destroyed. Every intervention was calibrated to incapacitate systems without compromising the lives of the crews. The ships drifted, but they weren't wrecked. The crews survived, uninjured. By the 17th minute, the Sovereign fleet was completely immobilized. Elena's transmission to Ozar's flagship arrived on an open frequency in Velhari, which she had learned during training, because Marcus had insisted the message be delivered without an automatic translator, because the absence of technological mediation carried a different weight. "Admiral Ozar," Elena said, "humanity is not at war with the Sovereign Consortium. This action was defensive. Your ships and crews are intact. I suggest you send a full report of this situation to the Galactic Assembly." There was a pause. Then Ozar's voice, which had remained composed throughout the entire engagement, came back. "What are you?" he asked. It was the same question he had asked in a whisper 17 minutes earlier, but with a different quality. It was no longer the question of an admiral analyzing a threat. It was something closer to the question of someone who had just seen something that didn't fit into any category they possessed. Elena considered the answer for a moment. "We are the species you weren't watching," she said. The transmission ended. In the control chamber of the Last Hope, Elena Voss opened her eyes for the first time in 17 minutes and let the superposition field stabilize at its minimum activity state. Her arms were completely steady. Her breathing was regular. Rajan, who had monitored her vitals throughout the operation, had noted in his log that the captain's average heart rate during the most improbable combat in galactic history had been 62 beats per minute, 8 beats below her recorded resting heart rate. The data arrived first as noise. The intelligence center of the new galactic coalition, established 3 years after the Neptune incident as part of the reform treaty that had replaced the Sovereign Consortium, received approximately 40,000 transmissions per cycle from every corner of the galaxy. Most were routine reports, trade flow, navigation data, colony updates, diplomatic communications. The automatic sorting system processed the 40,000 transmissions and flagged for human review those that didn't fit any recognized pattern. In that cycle, 19 transmissions were flagged. Senior analyst Dr. Yuki Tanaka had learned to trust her own intuition more than the sorting algorithm, not because the algorithm was bad, but because there were certain categories of anomalous data that algorithms by definition couldn't recognize because they were anomalous precisely because they didn't exist in any previous database. She read the 19 transmissions. 17 were minor navigation anomalies she resolved in 30 minutes. The 18th was a colony report with unusual latency, which she dispatched to the communication infrastructure team. The 19th stayed open on her screen for 40 minutes while she tried to determine exactly what she was looking at. It was a transmission from an astronomical observation station in the Lyrae Omega system, operated by the Soru, who had been among the first to voluntarily join the coalition after the events at Neptune. The transmission contained spectrographic data from a system 200 light-years from the outer rim, identified on navigation charts as KV7741, a binary system with no recorded life and no commercial interest. What the spectrographic data showed was that KV7741 had ceased to exist. It wasn't that its stars had collapsed. It wasn't that an extinction event had wiped out life. The system simply wasn't there anymore, in the most literal sense possible. Where observation instruments had recorded a binary system with 8 planets and a vast asteroid belt 6 months ago, there was now empty space, with the gravitational signature of a perfect vacuum, as if the system had never existed. Riley sent a message to Ambassador Sophia Reed, who had left active diplomatic work after the establishment of the coalition, but had remained as a special consultant for unknown class events, a position created specifically because of her demonstrated ability to recognize situations that fell outside normal management parameters. Sophia replied in 4 minutes. "Show me the full data." Over the next 6 days, 3 more systems reported the same phenomenon. All of them on the galaxy's outer edge, all in a progression that, when Riley plotted it on the galactic map, formed a line moving toward the galactic core at a speed the observation data suggested was approximately 2 systems per cycle. Marcus Webb, who had been called in to analyze the spectrographic data with his knowledge of quantum physics, stared at the projection for a very long time before saying anything. "It's not destruction," he finally said. "Destruction leaves residue, energy, debris, radiation fields. What's happening here is different." "Different how?" Sophia asked. "It's removal," Marcus said. "Matter isn't being converted into energy. It's not being dispersed. It's simply no longer being. It's as if the universe revised its history and decided those systems should never have existed." "Is that physically possible?" Riley asked. "Under the physics we know?" "No," Marcus said. "But we know the physics that evolved in our fragment of the universe over the last 13 billion years. We know nothing about what might exist in extragalactic space. The navigation data that arrived in the following days filled in some gaps, but not in a reassuring way. Automated probes sent to the edge of the removal zone had transmitted images of something no coalition species had ever catalogued. Mobile structures with dimensions estimated by sensors to be in the thousands of miles, with no heat emission, no conventional propulsion signature, and no detectable communication. They moved in formation, and as they approached a star system, that system simply ceased to exist in the sensor records. The Kethrai representative on the Coalition Council had given them the name that would stick in the official report, the Devourers. The Council's emergency meeting had been unanimous on only one conclusion. No known technology in the galaxy had the capacity to interact with the structures in a way the data suggested was necessary. Sovereign plasma cannons, tested in simulations against the estimated mass of the structures, produced results that impact physics models classified as equivalent to throwing stones into an ocean. The only technology in the galaxy that operated outside the parameters of classical physics was the Last Hope. And the only person who knew how to operate the Last Hope was on a farm in rural Kentucky, where she had spent the last 2 years trying to convince herself she had earned a retirement. Elena Voss opened her front door before Sophia had even reached the second step of the porch. "I saw the trajectory of events in the Coalition Security Report," Elena said. "I figured someone would show up sooner or later." "We're sorry for the interruption," Sophia said. "No, you're not." Elena stepped back from the door to let her in. "But I'll take the interruption anyway." She paused. "The coffee's ready." As Sophia explained what the data showed, Elena listened without interrupting. It was a skill she had developed long before her quantum training, honed to the point where people often mistook it for passivity until the moment she spoke, which invariably revealed she had processed every single detail. "The core problem," Elena said when Sophia finished, "isn't getting to them. In superposition, I can reach any position on the galaxy's edge in minimal operational time." "What is the core problem?" Sophia asked. "We don't know what they are. We don't know what makes them tick. And to use superposition effectively against something, I need to understand its pattern. Against the Sovereign Fleet, I understood the pattern because they were physical ships with conventional physics, with a formation geometry I could read as space." Elena picked up her mug. "If the data is right, these devourers don't operate on conventional physics, which means I don't have a space between them to read." "So what do you need?" Sophia asked. "I need someone to go to them first," Elena said. "Not to attack, to observe, to transmit real-time data while I make the approach. I need someone who understands both classical physics and the limits of the ship's quantum system, someone who can tell me what they're doing the moment they're doing it." "Ryan Miller," Sophia said immediately. "Ryan Miller," Elena confirmed. "In an observation probe with no combat signature, while I approach from the flank. But there's one more thing we need." She looked directly at Sophia. "We need someone who knows the Coalition well enough to get us access to every scrap of data on macroscopic matter removal phenomena. Any species that has even a fragment of a theory on what could cause this, no matter how speculative." "That could take weeks," Sophia said. "How many systems do we have before the Devourers reach the first inhabited system?" Sophia checked the projection on her handheld device. "At the current rate, 16 cycles," Elena calculated. A cycle corresponded to approximately 40 standard hours. 16 cycles was less than an Earth month. "Then we have enough time to do this right," Elena said. "Doing it fast would be easy. Doing it right will save the people who need saving." Sophia looked at her for a moment. "You didn't ask if the ship is still operational." "It is," Elena said. "I can feel it when it isn't. It's one of those things about operating a quantum system that's hard to explain to people who don't. And you didn't ask what happens if there is no solution, if there's no way to interact with them." Elena set her mug back on the kitchen counter. She looked out the farmhouse window at the field she had bought with the idea that she would learn to love the silence. She had discovered that silence was something she appreciated, but she wasn't born to inhabit it permanently. "There's always a way," she said. "The question is whether we're creative enough to find it before we need it." She turned to Sophia. "Call Marcus, too. He'll complain about the travel conditions, but he'll come." "How do you know?" "Because he always comes. That's the thing about people who spend 8 years building a ship no one believed would work. They don't stop when things get hard. They stop when they decide they're done, and Marcus Webb never decided he was done. And then, because there was a trip ahead and a farm that was going to be empty for an indefinite amount of time, Elena Voss went to get her backpack from the closet where she had stored it 2 years earlier, when she had tried to convince herself she wouldn't need it anymore. The backpack was in the same spot. She had always known it was. Ryan Miller had spent 11 days on the observation probe Kestrel 1. The probe was 140 feet long, with a pressurized cabin for 2 occupants, state-of-the-art passive sensor systems that could record information without emitting a detectable signal, and a supply reserve calculated for 30 days. What it didn't have was a window. That had been a deliberate engineering decision to reduce structural vulnerability points, and Ryan had accepted it as reasonable during the design phase. But he had revised his opinion after 8 days of seeing nothing but data displays. What the data displays showed, however, made up for anything a window could offer. Ryan had approached the Devourers at a distance that Coalition safety models classified as deeply ill-advised, and intelligence models classified as the only position offering usable data. The safety models and intelligence models had clashed. Ryan had resolved the conflict by remembering he was the only one on the probe, and therefore the most qualified person to assess the situation. What he had discovered in those 11 days of observation had completely reshaped his understanding of the phenomenon. The Devourers weren't machines in the sense the word implies. They weren't mechanical constructions operating on programmed logic. What Ryan had identified through passive spectral analysis of their energy fields was something both more disturbing and more fascinating. They were macroscopic mathematical processors existing in a state of continuous computation. Not digital computation, physical computation. The matter around them was literally reconfigured as a calculation operation, and when the calculation was complete, the matter had been consumed by the process, and the result was recorded in a data structure existing in the quantum substrate of space-time itself. They didn't destroy star systems out of malice or strategy. They destroyed them because processing the quantum states of all the matter in a system was, for them, the natural equivalent of a biological organism absorbing nutrients. They were hungry in the most literal sense. The entire galaxy was, to them, untapped computational resources. The most important information Ryan had collected, however, wasn't about what the Devourers did. It was about how they did it. To process a system's matter, they first had to stabilize it, reduce all the indeterminate quantum states of the system's objects to defined, measurable states, so the matter could be used as a reliable computational substrate. It was a process of macroscopic quantum collapse, operated by ordering fields that the probe's sensors identified as continuous low-frequency emissions. In other words, to eat, the Devourers first had to organize the food, and organization, by definition, eliminated chaos. Ryan sent the analysis to the Last Hope via the encrypted short-range communication channel Elena had installed specifically for the operation. The transmission arrived while Elena was in the control chamber, keeping the superposition field in a state of minimal activity 3 light-years away, waiting for the data that would tell her what she needed to know. She read the analysis twice. Then, she opened the voice channel to Marcus, who was in the ship's operations center with the technical team, monitoring systems and consuming amounts of coffee that 2 crew members of other species had commented on, with some apprehension, as being biologically incomprehensible. "Marcus," Elena said, "did you read Ryan's report?" "Just finished," Marcus said. "They collapse quantum states to process matter. It's elegant, actually. Completely ruthless, but elegant." "What happens to a processor when you introduce a variable it can't collapse?" There was a pause. The kind of pause Marcus made when an idea was forming that he hadn't quite articulated yet, because he needed to be sure it was as good as it sounded before saying it out loud. "A variable that exists in multiple states simultaneously," Marcus said slowly, "which by definition cannot be collapsed into a single determined state." "Exactly," Elena said. "Elena," Marcus said. And now there was something in his voice that Ryan would recognize as the tone Marcus used when he was simultaneously excited and genuinely terrified by what he was considering. "You're proposing diving the ship into total superposition right in their processing field." "I'm proposing that the ship exists in a state that is physically incompatible with their collapse process," Elena said. "A system in true quantum superposition cannot be collapsed by any external ordering field because the ordering field itself becomes a variable of the system that the superposition incorporates. It's like trying to use water to dry water." In theory, Marcus said. In theory. In practice, we've never kept the ship in total superposition for more than 40 seconds under lab conditions. What you're describing would require indefinite total superposition while interacting with energy fields on the scale of the Devourers. I know, Elena said. If the field collapses during immersion. I know, Marcus. Ryan is on the probe less than 2 light-years from them. I know. There was a longer silence. How long do you need to reach them? Marcus finally asked. From our current point in superposition, 32 seconds, Elena said. The immersion time needed to overload their processing capacity is what I don't know. Ryan, can you calculate it? Ryan's voice came through the comms channel with a 0.4-second delay. Based on the field capacity data I collected for an unresolvable superposition object to overload their processing system, it needs to maintain that state long enough for the system to attempt to resolve the indeterminacy more times than its tolerance parameters allow. Estimate: between 6 and 15 minutes. 6 to 15 minutes of total superposition, Marcus repeated. The current record is 40 seconds, Ryan said. I know the current record, Elena said. I set the current record. Elena, Ryan said, it's not a matter of skill, it's a matter of human biology. The state of consciousness required to maintain total superposition is cognitively exhausting. In prolonged tests, the ability to maintain the state without intentional collapse degrades at a rate of approximately 20% per minute after the second minute. In prolonged tests where I knew I was being tested, Elena said, where there was a metric I was trying to hit. Silence. Ryan, she said, you built a ship that works because humans evolved in chaos, that operates because minds shaped by millennia of uncertainty can inhabit probability states that other beings can't. What happens when you put that same mind in a state where certainty isn't an option? Ryan's response took 15 seconds. It thrives, he finally said. Give me the approach coordinates, Elena said. What happened over the next 42 minutes was recorded by the sensors on Ryan's probe, by the monitoring systems of the Last Hope, and by 22 coalition observation ships that had positioned themselves at a safe distance after receiving word that something was about to happen, even if no one could explain exactly what. The Last Hope entered the Devourer's processing field in a state of total superposition. From an external physical standpoint, the ship simply ceased to exist in any determined way. Sensors couldn't locate it in any single position. They couldn't measure its speed. They couldn't calculate its trajectory. It was like trying to observe an object that had decided not to be observable. From the Devourer's perspective, whose entire existence was based on the ability to collapse indeterminacy into usable computation, the ship was an anomaly their systems tried to resolve, and tried again, and kept trying. Because the ship existed in a state that could not be resolved, every attempt at collapse produced a new state of superposition that incorporated the attempt itself as a variable, creating a cascade of indeterminacy that expanded as the system tried to contain it. Elena Voss, inside the ship's control chamber, wasn't thinking about quantum collapse. She wasn't thinking about Devourers. She wasn't thinking about coordinates or time or Ryan's data. She was thinking about an afternoon in New Orleans when she was 12 years old, standing in the middle of a crowd during Mardi Gras, with music coming from 6 directions at once and people in costumes of colors there weren't enough words to describe, and she had felt the sensation that the world was simultaneously larger than anything her mind could hold, and perfectly, completely present in that single instant. It was the closest state she could reach, in memory, to what existed between intention and instinct. The superposition field responded to this with 98% stability. 42 minutes later, the Devourer's processing fields suffered what coalition physicists would later describe as a cascading indeterminacy overload. Every processing unit in the swarm tried to resolve the unresolvable object. Every attempt expanded the computational load, and when the system's tolerance limit was exceeded, The Devourers simply stopped. They weren't destroyed. They were, for the first time in their existence, unable to process. The structures hung motionless in space, their processing fields dark, like machines that had tried to calculate the value of infinity and crashed before reaching the answer. The Last Hope emerged from the state of total superposition 42 minutes and 11 seconds after entering it. It was the new record. Ryan, on the observation probe, stared at the data for a long time. Then he opened the communication channel. "Elena," he said, "are you okay?" The response took a few seconds. "Yes," she said, "I'm okay." 42 minutes, he said. "That's what the timer says," she agreed. "Did it feel longer?" he asked, because there was something in the biometric data he wanted to understand. "No," Elena said. "It felt like exactly 42 minutes. I was there for every one of them." Ryan looked at his data, then at the motionless structures of the Devourers floating silently in space, like monuments to the limitations of pure order. "You know what this means," he said. "The whole galaxy is going to want to know how this was done. They'll want to replicate it. They'll want to build more ships." "They can't," Elena said with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent 2 years learning exactly why. "Not the way it works, I know, but they'll try anyway." "That's the human part of the problem," Elena said. "Let me talk to Sophia." And in the operations center of the Last Hope, Marcus Webb looked at the sensor display, confirming the silence of the Devourers, then at the coffee mug on the counter beside him, and then at the mix of crew members around him, human and non-human, people who had traveled together to the most dangerous place in the galaxy for reasons no conventional survival algorithm could justify, and he thought that maybe that was exactly the point. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy late. They had arrived small, underestimated, ridiculed, and ignored. They had been forbidden from arming themselves, taxed beyond reason, and watched their peripheral colonies be destroyed while the great powers tended to other priorities. And then they had built a ship, just one, because humanity had learned over millennia of history that no other species had shared, that power wasn't about quantity. It was about the right kind of thing, used the right way, at the right moment, by people who understood not just what they had in their hands, but why they had it. The Last Hope remained stationed in the rings of Neptune after that day. It was never replicated. It was never transferred to the command of any alliance or consortium. It remained under the command of Captain Elena Voss for as long as she wanted to keep it, and then under a succession of human pilots who had gone through the same impossible process of learning not to try to control what couldn't be controlled. The galaxy learned to respect humans, not for their capacity for destruction, which had proven to be considerable, but for the reason Primarch Vel-Katan, in a private conversation with Sophia Reed 2 years after the events at Neptune, had described with the expression of someone revising an equation they had miscalculated for a long time. Because you are the only species that built the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, had the opportunity to use it to dominate, and chose to park it. Sophia had replied, "We had examples of what not to do. We took them to heart." And because she was Sophia Reed, and because she had spent decades learning that the most important things usually fit into very few words, she had stopped there. The end. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. The galaxy is vast. The stories are infinite, and humans are still just getting started.